Mate, speaking of AUKUS,
Yeah.
that seems to me like another horse that has been beaten far past its own death.
It is.
Can you tell me about the recent developments?
Yeah, so when we're talking about AUKUS, we're not talking about the whale. We're
Yeah.
talking about AUKUS, the Australia, United Kingdom, US trilateral military agreement.
Yes.
So we actually did our first podcast 10 months ago now.
Yeah, I reckon so. Yeah.
About 10 months ago on AUKUS.
On AUKUS.
Because it's one of those things where it just made the newspaper. It was on the front of every newspaper in Australia for, I think, 2 weeks possibly.
Yeah.
And it's a big deal. It is actually a big deal. It is the most money ever spent on any defence policy ever in Australia's history. So it's $368 billion.
It's a staggering amount of money.
Correct? Yes.
A truly staggering amount of money.
Yes. So
And I think you and me as well, when we first, even back then, when it was first announced and we first saw it, I think you and I had a certain opinion of what was happening.
Yeah.
And I think our opinion hasn't, as time has progressed, I don't think our opinions on the subject have changed. And I think the more information comes out, I think the more our opinions become solidified. Would that be safe? Yeah.
Yes. 100%. So the first pillar of AUKUS is that we are going to acquire 3 nuclear submarines, Virginia-class, from the United States.
Yep. So
And-
120 billion apiece.
Correct.
Fantastic.
Well,
deal.
not quite. Because we're gonna acquire 3 Virginia-class nuclear submarines from
Yeah.
the United States, and then we're going to develop and construct 4 of our own SSN AUKUS with the United Kingdom. So we're going to use a UK nuclear reactor inside these boats, and I think the shells are going to be built potentially here in South Australia.
Yep.
Couple things to point out. Part of this deal is not just to actually acquire the boats and buy them. And this is what I find quite startling in some ways, is that a whole lot of the money that is part of AUKUS is being sent to the UK and the United States to subsidise their shipbuilding industry.
Yeah.
Which that is as far as like a deal goes, that is a terrible deal for Australia.
It's a terrible deal. Yeah.
Because it joins us to the hip of their defence industry and any future engagements that we really have.
Yeah.
We're really like just putting all of our cards into one play.
Yes. And also I think it's important to note, I think that those two countries, well, the United Kingdom specifically, but like it has actually essentially been sucked dry of like the ruling class, the oligarchic banking class in the UK has essentially sucked the nation dry of any wealth, essentially. So they just do not have the money in their coffers to be able to do this.
And this is why we're subsidising their shipbuilding industry.
Exactly, yeah.
So
who's a sucker?
2 weeks ago, our Defence Minister, Richard Marles, went and met the new Secretary of Defence, Hegseth, Pete Hegseth, and they discussed AUKUS, and Richard Marles asked whether Trump was going to support AUKUS. And surprise, surprise, Trump's going to support AUKUS, because he said it was a great deal.
Yeah, well, for him it was fantastic, dude. You don't get much. Yeah,
you don't get much from that. So we just gave them $500 million US. I think it's about 800 million Australian.
This is like a progress payment
This
type
is a
thing.
progress payment, non-refundable.
Fantastic.
Absolutely great. So I think we're going to provide, I think it's 4 or 5 billion to the US and another 3 or 4 to the UK. When asked, Pete Hegseth was asked, are we going to see the Virginia class boats? He said, quote, I sure hope so.
As long as he's hopeful, Julie. As long as he's hopeful about it, dude. Yeah. Wow, yeah.
But I just had this great image of us sitting there, and actually I'm pretty sure Richard Marles said this, that they actually sent the money to the Yanks. And like they waited for the money to clear, and it was kind of like in person where they were sitting there, and they like got the digital receipt, and they're like, "Here, we sent you the money." Like, "Oh, great!" And we shook hands, and they're like, "Are we going to get the boats?" And he's like, "Oh, sure, hope so."
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah,
that's far out. That's sad.
It is quite sad.
But also, like you were saying, it's not just the financial imbalance of the situation. It is also, like you said, a complete reorientation and reintegration of our military posture, because in the future this will essentially, so it's got, the idea is, correct me if I'm wrong, to integrate militarily all 3 of our militaries, and then obviously we will no longer be able to separate ourselves from them in our exact theatre, if that kind of makes sense.
Yes. So before we get the boats, we've now just invested the numbers, I just keep forgetting the numbers because they're just so astronomical. It's like tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and it's just like, fuck. So we're about to, we've just invested, I think it's a couple $100 million into building a new naval base or renovating a new naval base in Western Australia where the United States and the UK will dock their nuclear submarines.
Yes.
So that's obviously part of it as well.
I like how you said their nuclear submarines,
It's
not our nuclear
submarines.
submarines.
So they will dock their nuclear submarines here in Western Australia. So it's really also about integration and not just buying the boats. However, as you said before, we were always very pessimistic of AUKUS.
Oh, dude, yeah.
He's pessimistic,
Yeah.
right? And there was obviously the French nuclear deal before that, where we went to buy nuclear submarines from the French.
Yeah.
That fell through.
Yeah.
Scott Morrison obviously went behind their backs and created AUKUS.
Yeah.
It really was his brainchild.
Yeah.
Interesting, though. So what I like to do now, when I am skeptical of something, or I want to kind of get the insider's knowledge of how does like the military establishment here in Australia see things.
Yeah.
I always go to ASPI, which is the
of course.
Australian Strategic Policy Institute.
Yeah.
Funded by the Australian military.
I've got a fun little nugget on ASPI later on in the show, but continue.
Yeah. Funded by US weapons manufacturers.
Yeah. US Department of State.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're not biased. They're very
Yes.
very,
An independent source.
An independent source, correct. Interesting. So this is from The Strategist, and this article is really interesting because it's written by Peter Briggs, who's a retired submarine specialist and was the past president of the Submarine Institute of Australia. I'm none of those things.
Yep.
Don't take my word for what I'm saying.
Yep.
However, I would think that this guy is pretty informed.
Yep.
He's a submarine specialist. This entire article was just talking about how we need to abandon AUKUS now and go buy nuclear submarines from the French.
Wow.
It's not even just like, maybe, there's certain parts of AUKUS that we need to reform. It was like, we need to scrap this and be prepared that we are not getting these subs. So basically, what he was saying was that inside the British shipbuilding right now, they are just so underfunded. They can't even produce the ballistic missiles for their current submarine systems.
Yeah.
So there's even now talks about they don't even have blueprints for the new SSN AUKUS submarines they're going to build.
Wow. So this is a completely hypothetical, speculative concept.
Completely hypothetical. Yeah. That's right. And apparently they're going to be so big and bulky that they're going to displace more water than any current nuclear submarines.
Wow.
They're going to be more detectable than any current submarines.
Yeah.
And that comes as we're seeing now more and more drone warfare.
Yes.
And anti-submarine warfare.
Yes.
So the Chinese now have been developing underwater drones specifically designed to target submarines.
Well, dude, even the the Iranians,
I
think recently unveiled like a naval drone ship.
Yeah.
We've seen that even a nation like Yemen, one of the poorest nations in the world, has essentially managed to defeat the US Navy in the Bab al-Mandeb Strait.
Yes.
Essentially with just like jet skis, boats, drones, and so we're seeing that in order to have military naval, and I'm not a military strategist or a submariner or anything like that, but we've seen how you don't need to have a huge open water navy with huge aircraft carriers and ships to be able to decisively, meet your objectives essentially.
Yeah. So there was a couple points in this article. One was obviously talking about just the disarray that the United Kingdom's in, but also for the fact that...
barely a country, dude, at this stage. My goodness.
Pretty much. But also the fact that the Royal Australian Navy is, I'm quoting from this, the Royal Australian Navy is already unable to crew its ships and grow to meet future demands. It will have great difficulty in crewing Virginias, which need 132 people each, and the SSN AUKUS boats. 2, if their crews equal to the 100-odd needed for the current British Astute class. So we don't even have enough people inside the Navy to crew these submarines.
So obviously you think logically, provided we can't meet those numbers, and even if we could, we can't provide them to the adequate training on these new systems and new equipment because it doesn't exist and no one's even designed it yet or even has concepts of it, then in order to match these naval capabilities, I guess we're just going to have US seamen and British seamen,
or a massive recruitment surge.
Yeah.
But this comes hand in hand as the ADF is already struggling to get people to join the military, the Air Force or the Navy.
If you're a young person in Australia, you'll see ads on bus stops, billboards. You're watching a YouTube video, plenty of join the ADF careers. And to some, it may be appealing, bit of an exciting lifestyle. But however, I don't think Australians are motivated or, shall we say, patriotic enough, or willing to die in wars that do not benefit us.
And the pay is just not that great either.
Well, it is better than... It's one of the best paid militaries in the world as an entry level, but still, it's not like if you're a grunt, you're a grunt.
Yeah, you're a grunt. But so he concludes though in this article.
Yeah, sorry.
So
I derailed you there. I apologise.
The situation flags. This situation flags an increasing likelihood that despite its best efforts, the U.S. Navy will be unable to spare any Virginias for sale to Australia. The president of the day probably will be unable, as legislation requires, to certify 270 days before the transfer it will not degrade US undersea capabilities. So when the date comes to sell us the submarines, if it degrades the US's capabilities, they will just simply not sell us the submarines.
Wow.
And what do you think the United States is going to do?
Well, they just have a history of being such a trustworthy and reliable partner, Geordie.
Yeah. So
that's bad. But I guess for if you're an Australian PM, no matter who you are, you kind of the opposition's going to politically wedge you.
Yeah.
Because they're just going to say, "Oh, you backed out from our biggest ally, and then obviously you've left us defenseless." Rah rah rah. So you kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, that's right.
From a political point of view.
Yeah, that's right. And it's just that this is the other thing that you can criticise about AUKUS. And I was reading the Australian Foreign Affairs by Carmen Lawrence the other day, quite a good article, and he was discussing AUKUS as well. And he said this is not about the acquisition of nuclear submarines.
No, yeah.
It's tying us to the US's policy of containing China.
Yeah.
And it goes, the fact that AUKUS ties Australia more firmly than ever to the US warfighting posture and why we are so conspicuously signing up to a US project aimed at containing China and thus risking engagement in a war over Taiwan. And that's what AUKUS is about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, China being our biggest trading partner.
Yes.
And we have a trade surplus with China. We have a trade deficit with the US. Our trade deficit is going to get a lot bigger as AUKUS progresses.
Correct, that's right.
So it really just seems like a short-sighted...
It is. And what's so sad about it was the way that the Labor Party were just kind of like forced into a position of having to adopt it. And it really kind of ties both parties into supporting now that kind of very pro-US foreign policy.
Yeah.
As the article says, it says, from Labor, there is only silence on why it abandoned its long-held opposition to nuclear power, as well as its previous aspirations for a more independent Australian foreign policy. Surely we can do better than what looks like timid subservience to a declining power.
That's very well put.
Yes.
Very well put. And it also leads me to think, like, what a sad reality. Can you think of any other example, and I'm sure there are, of a nation that is gleefully trying to cling back the attention of its colonizer?
Yeah.
As in with Britain and the US as a de facto kind of power? Like, where else? You didn't see the Algerians going to the French going, please take us back.
No.
You know? Or the Vietnamese or something. Like, it's just, it boggles the mind. It truly boggles the mind from my point of view.
And also, I think it highlights as well, for example, Clive Palmer saying that we're living in, a tumultuous time, the world's changing, but our political class cannot come to with realities that the US is a declining power.
Yes. And I guess that's what I'll be talking a bit about this later on. But no, it's right. And times do shift and nations need to be responsible and realistic and, assess what is in the best interest of the nation and its people. Yeah. But I guess as we are essentially just a resource colony and a financial colony, and this really does demonstrate a colonial relationship in that our capital is being sucked overseas and we're not receiving anything from it. It just doesn't seem like there's much to do.
And look, we'll keep looking into this. We'll keep doing the podcast. And when we're about 50 years old, we might get the bonus as well.
And we probably, as soon as the news breaks, we will be the first ones onto it. Don't worry.
Okay.